Welcome to Windows on the World. Tonight we're going to look at Christianity and the Roman cult. Last week's show was called The Creation of History, how history has been rewritten and how it's difficult to decode what history actually really is. The obscuring and rewriting of history makes for a challenging job in decoding myths and propaganda. Well, Britain's ancient history has been rewritten not only, of course, by the Romans and Normans, but by their own invaded entity, the Roman Catholic Church. The Universal Church took over, of course, and its cover story is that most Christian churches started to appear around 600 AD, often named after saints of the Catholic Church. The cover story goes that the date of 597 AD is the date the Roman Church officially brought Christianity to pagan Britain. In 597 AD, St. Augustine came to Anglo-Saxon Canterbury. He was sent by Pope Gregory the Great to re-establish Christianity in England. I like that. This is actually from English Heritage website, and they actually say re-establish Christianity in England. Also known as the Gregorian Mission, Augustine, with around 40 other religious figures or monks, arrived on the shores of the Kent coast to convert King Ethelbert and his kingdom to Christianity. Such was his success that by the 7th century, the Christianization of Britain was complete. Well, that's the cover story. What this means is that the infiltration and control by the Roman Church was a success. What the Roman Church is saying is that they brought Christianity to Britain. It is not just an exaggeration, of course, but an outright lie. The Universal Church and its adoption of the pagan altar, which does not belong in any Christian church, brought with it the corporate controlling entity, which was just an extension of Roman rule. Its priesthood, Roman canon law and rituals have nothing whatsoever to do with early Christianity. We have to look also at the Council of Nicaea, and it was a council of so-called Christian bishops convened in the Bithynian city of Nicaea, which is now in Turkey, by Emperor Constantine. The Council of Nicaea met from May until the end of July 325 AD. The Ecumenical Council was the first of many efforts to attain consensus in the Church through an assembly representing all Christendom. Hosius of Corduba may have presided over its deliberations, so there is still a lot of mystery around this event. Its main accomplishments were settlement of the Christological issue, in other words, of the divine nature of God the Son and his relationship to God the Father, the construction of the first part of the Nicene Creed, mandating uniform observance of the date of Easter, and the promulgation of early canon law. That's the most important thing that came out of it, because the Roman canons have been what imposes the Roman cult onto their audience, their followers, their congregation. Major characters in modern Christianity, we should know what they were as well, were Pepin the Short. He was king of the Franks from 751 AD until he died in 768, and he was the first Carolingian to become a king. Pepin was the son of the Frankish prince Charles Martel. Charles Martel helped Roman Christianity remain Europe's major religion by defeating the Muslim armies at the Battle of Tours in 732. Of course, later the Knights Templar took over. All of this was encapsulated into the Roman cult of the Universal Church. And the stories made up by the Roman Church are overdone and often ludicrous. The stories of their saints are repeated in different versions. For example, say the story of St. Patrick being shipwrecked off the Isle of Anglesey could have been stolen from an earlier story about a druid. None of these stories have to even make sense, and often they don't. There are exceptions, such as St. Bartholomew, who seems to be a real historical figure, but the later stories about him are probably made up too. The Vikings and Anglo-Saxons had a hand in ransacking these early Roman churches also. And we have to remember that it was a very turbulent time. Irish or Celtic church and the Roman Christian practices were very different indeed. So when we've talked about this early Christianity being in Ireland, I think that's a very important thing. We're talking about the British Isles, and of course our show, The Lost Order of Knowledge, went into that, and there's a link there to a documentary called The Last Druid, which is very interesting, goes on about the early Irish kings and the true Christianity before the Roman Church got involved. Because of course the difference between the Irish and the Irish Celtic and the Roman Church was that, for instance, there was two different ways of calculating the date of Easter. And of course then we've got the Gregorian calendar. So all of this stuff was imposed on top of what was already there. And that's really where we're going with this show. The very early Christianity was in Britain, and there seems to be circumstantial evidence for that. Of course, we're never going to get evidence because the Romans controlled everything. Later on, of course, the Normans, Anglo-Saxons, but to a greater degree, the Roman Church was the controlling factor of Christianity. The differences were eventually absorbed, of course, and then, of course, we had the Mary cult, which had taken over Ireland by the 1800s due to not only the Roman Church, but also the crypto-Sabbateans who'd infiltrated the priesthood. So a lot of the Irish priests and the priests in Britain were Sabbatean Frankists, and we covered that in our show, The Irish Count, They Warned You. It was about the way that Ireland especially was infiltrated by this cult of Mary. In other words, it took the onus of Jesus and put it onto Mary. So in other words, it's a way of diluting the Christianity. And that was quite successful, especially in Ireland. So these two groups, the crypto-Sabbateans and the Roman cult, have worked hand in hand to bring in the now globalist Antichrist church. Yes, They Warned You, the Irish Count, was about the Sabbatean infiltration of Ireland and the Mary cult, which came from these crypto-Kabbalists. So the Mary cult had nothing to do with Christianity whatsoever. The Catholic priests are nothing more than gatekeepers, and the Church of England is now the most spineless corporate entity. So going back again to the later destruction of history, let's have a look at the English Heritage website, and it states, a Viking raid on the island of Lindisfarne, just off the Northumbrian coast, was not the first in England. A few years before, in 789, 3 ships of Norsemen had landed on the coast of Wessex and killed the king's reeve who had been sent to bring the strangers to the West Saxon court. But the assault on Lindisfarne was different because it attacked the sacred heart of the Northumbrian kingdom, desecrating the very place where the Christian religion began in our nation. So what they say in these references is quite revealing when you look at it in the respect of trying to decode what is actually going on. It was where Cuthbert had been bishop and where his body was now revered as that of a saint. So this raid on Lindisfarne was very important because it was an ancient Christian site, as of course is the Isle of Iona in Scotland. So when this happened, news of this raid reached Alcuin, a Northumbrian scholar living far away in the Frankish kingdom, where he was tutor to the children of King Charlemagne. Alcuin was aghast at this unprecedented atrocity, so he wrote to Higbald, Bishop of Lindisfarne, and said it was a place more sacred than any in Britain. The 9th century Viking onslaught, which laid waste to Lindisfarne, Whitby, Teignmouth Priory and many others, almost destroyed the whole church in the north and the east of England. So we had a lot of this ransacking of churches, and it happened a lot in Kent, the Anglo-Saxons and of course the Vikings. But King Alfred of Wessex and his successors laboured to revive the church in Lindisfarne and was soon aided by Christianised Scandinavian settlers, and so this spread out. These were among the first to revere the Holy King Edmund of East Anglia, whom their ancestors had actually martyred in 869. So when we look at this and the disruptions that have gone on, we do see these remaining churches, but of course they're all stated to be after St. Augustine arrived in Britain, which has to be complete nonsense. The 10th century brought a far more thoroughgoing revival, headed by Dunstan, Archbishop of Canterbury, 960 to 88, and continued under King Canute, 1016 to 1035. Monasteries were founded or re-established, often following the Europe-wide Benedictine rule. These included Westminster Abbey in London, Mushelney Abbey in Somerset, and Deerhurst Priory in Gloucestershire, by whose gate Odder's Chapel was built in 1056. Now, if you go around Britain, you can see the Norman churches. Now, these, of course, were on much more ancient sites, so the Normans were rebuilding them in their own way. And when we look at the most ancient churches in England, we always do go back to this little sign that's on there saying erected around 600 AD. So the 10th century brought a far more thoroughgoing revival. And so what we're seeing here is really the eliminating and covering up of the early Christianity. Now, we can go into the builder of Odder's Chapel in Gloucestershire, which was built in 1056. And this is meant to be a very important site. Its builder was Earl Odder, and he was a relation of King Edward the Confessor, himself honoured as a saint in his own lifetime. Cooperation between monarchs and clergy, together with leadership in culture and learning, had been a hallmark of the English church. Yet within a decade of the Norman conquest, many of its traditions would be swept away, again, of course. So then we get the Norman influence on law. So not only did we have the Roman law, the Roman cult, the Roman Catholic cult, then we had the Norman influence as well. And these kind of worked hand in hand. We're talking about a law system which was very different from the old laws and the what they call the common law systems of ancient Britain. So we have to realise that both the Roman cult and the Normans, and to an extent the Anglo-Saxons, but not as much, brought in this law system. The Roman law system is very, very similar to the Sabbatean Frankists and what they have done to the church. And a lot of people don't realise that. When you look at Roman law, it's very, very similar to Noahide law in certain respects. So the first few months of the year 793, Anglo-Saxon writers recalled in northern England how immense whirlwinds, flashes of lightning and fiery dragons were seen in the sky. So they thought these aerial phenomena were portents of imminent disaster. Well, that is something that, of course, is very ancient and we cover all the time. And sure enough, a great famine followed, but worse was to come on the 8th of June. So these are all like portents of doom that they saw happening. Heathen men came and miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. So they linked that to this famine which followed this explosion in the sky, the fiery comet or the meteor's showers. And scholar and theologian Alcuin of York was particularly worried about why God and so great a company of saints had allowed this most holy of places to suffer. He advised Higbald to examine his conscience to see if there was any reason why God might have allowed such a terrible disaster to happen. Is this the outcome of the sins of those who live here, he asked. It has not happened by chance, but is the sign of some great guilt. Well, there you go. Roman Catholic guilt programming is deep and it makes people dumb. He wondered too whether the ransacking of a Christian church by non-believers would lead to greater suffering. Was Alcuin perhaps implying that he thought he knew why God's wrath had been visited upon Northumbria? Not really. The sky was telling them what it had told those who witnessed the previous cataclysms which have formed the earth of the present day. The concept that God allowed such a terrible thing to happen ties in with the whole Catholic system, that the masses suffer because they do, and the priests control the lot of them. There is no connection between these beliefs and the early Christianity, which seems to have existed in Britain before the storytellers took over. The Roman history of the Druids is another striking example. and it goes against earlier civilizations which they had to steal from and destroy. Well, that appears to be what happened, as the dumbing down of the early church and priesthood, along with control through the canon law system, is definitely not any form of progress. It's definitely, though, a form of overt control. The Catholic Church of today is as anti-Christian as any demonic cult. Demonology and black magic have always been a part of Roman Catholicism. Of course, they were part of Mithraism. The worshipping of relics and bones and the internment in lead-lined coffins of some of the popes are just based on the belief system of black magic. The sacrificial altar is always behind the priest, and their priests turned their back on God after Vatican II. Well, that's according to Bishop Richard Williamson, a rare Catholic who actually tells the truth about some of our history. The idea of confession was just really, when you think about it, local community intelligence gathering by the priests. And of course, it introduced self-loathing, which only those in long frocks can deal with. Nothing to do with the early Christianity whatsoever. The theory that Britain was the original home of Christianity has been covered in our Shattered Isles show, so do look at that, because that's where I'm going with a lot of this stuff. And I wanted to get on to the Holy Grail story, because that has some real interesting aspects to it. I'm going to have a very short break and I'll be back in a couple of minutes. Welcome back. That first section was a bit breakneck, but I had to get a lot of stuff in there. We're talking about 1800 years of history. Of course, you can't cram it all into 17 minutes, but I wanted to give an overview there. And what we're talking about here is the rewriting of history, really. We're trying to decode the real history of the British Isles. I find this a fascinating subject. I find the decoding of history around the world a fascinating subject, but when we're up against the Roman cult and its legends and stories and imposed canons and laws, we're up against something very, very big, and it's a propaganda machine that's been going on a very long time. And the Romans knew all about propaganda and still do. Of course, the Universal Church covers all aspects of the Church of England. So, as we said, there is no church in Britain anymore. So it would be good to find out where it all started. And I've been fascinated by this subject for a really long time. I used to speak to a researcher who was very well read and instructed really in Catholicism and also the workings of the Jesuits. And quite interestingly, the late Kevin Boyle told me that he went along to his local priest who was a Jesuit, and he was very concerned about the 9/11 attacks and the cover stories that were being given and the false terror attacks that happened since, plus other things. And the Jesuit priest says, do not concern yourself with these things. Go home and look after your family. Do not bother about them again, and do not ever mention it to me again. Well, Kevin was so annoyed, I think he wanted to actually thump the fella, you know. But that is really what this is about. Of course, it's a control system, but we're trying to get beyond that. The Holy Grail story has been incorporated into the fake Christian cults such as the Rosicrucians and the cover stories of the Knights Templar and of course the King Arthur stories, all starting around the 1200s and continuing through the 1700s with Templar Freemasonry. I'm going to look at a very interesting aspect to the Grail story, and this is actually from an encyclopedia. It's called the Encyclopedia of Mysteries, and it has some great stuff in it. Everything from people who've spontaneously combusted to Saint Germain, the cult of Saint Germain, and ancient history. It's a great sort of springboard for other research and people who've miraculously appeared and disappeared in history. So all this stuff actually does tie into what we're talking about. We're talking about really the production of stories and the Holy Grail. So the quest for the Holy Grail is one of the most haunting themes in Christian history, of course, because it has been highlighted by these groups. By legend, the Grail is the cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, rescued from Pontius Pilate by Christ's uncle Joseph of Arimathea, and brought to Britain as a sacred talisman for the early church, buried or lost somewhere near Glastonbury. Now this is so interesting because Glastonbury was the key to early Christianity, according to Collins Beaumont and many others. And if you go to Somerset, you may be able to pick that up, that it was a very important place. The history kind of oozes out of it. And of course, Glastonbury has been turned into a New Age freak show, fancy dress puppet show, really. And I think that's all by design. I think that was a social engineering concept to actually further bury and destroy the importance of this place, Glastonia, as it used to be called. And it was the earliest Christian centre in Britain. It became the object of a search that lasted many centuries. King Arthur's knights mysteriously found the Grail, by which time it was regarded not only as a Christian relic, but also as a magical vessel that also contained hints of an early and secret wisdom. Now, I have to actually add something here, that I've talked to an alternative historian who I won't mention, and he very much pushes the Freemasonic side of the story. And he was saying that this legend of the Grail is very important in Freemasonry. Of course it is, because it's a mystery. And of course, how do you keep people off the track and the scent of reality? Through a mystery, of course. So, it was a magical vessel that also contained secret wisdom. So the story goes. As obscurely as it was found, the Grail disappeared again and has been sought by scholars ever since. It is this blend of occult with religious legend that sets the Grail apart from other Christian relics and makes it an essential part of a wider search for lost knowledge. The first question is how much truth there is in the physical reality of the Grail and its supposed journey to Britain. Initially, the circumstantial evidence is fairly encouraging. There is the hard historical fact recorded in the Gospels that Joseph and Nicodemus received the body of Christ and buried it. The suggestion that Joseph was Christ's uncle is made somewhat plausible by the fact that Pilate was willing to give him the body at all. Since Christ had been condemned as a criminal, he would have been buried as such in the place reserved unless, under Roman or Jewish law, a relative came to claim the body and dispose of it. St. Matthew tells us that Joseph was rich, and there is no reason to doubt this. If he could afford to provide Christ with a tomb, he must have been quite wealthy. By tradition, he made his money in the tin grade, and the legendary route that he took with the Grail to Britain, which is actually illustrated on a map here, agrees very well with the trade route for tin described by the Greek writer Diodorus shortly before the birth of Christ. Tin, he wrote, was transported at low tide to the island of Ichthys, thought to be St. Michael's Mount, in a bay off southern Cornwall. Now, of course, this is the story that Joseph of Arimathea arrived. Now, let's add something to this story. What if he didn't arrive, but he was from here and he was a tin merchant anyway? Just think about that, because when we talk about the origins of Christianity, the whole of the diversion seems to be to get people away from Britain and to this place in the Middle East. So it says, hence the merchants transport the tin they buy of the inhabitants to Gaul, and for 30 days' journey they carry it in sacks upon horses' backs through Gaul to the mouth of the River Rhone. Independent tradition in northern France, Western Ireland, Gloucester, North London and the Cornish tin mining region all tell of Joseph's involvement in the tin trade. The Cornish ones are particularly specific. A foreman tinsmith in the region was recorded early this century as saying, "We workers in metal are a very odd fraternity. Unlike other handicrafts, we have our own traditions among us." One of these, the memory of which is preserved in this invocation, is that Joseph made voyages to Cornwall in his own ships, and that on one occasion he brought with him the child Christ and his mother and landed them at St. Michael's Mount. A visit to Britain by the young Jesus with Joseph is historically feasible and backed up by a certain amount of local legend. Nothing is known of Jesus' life between the ages of 12 and 30, which was the start of his ministry, and he is widely believed to have travelled abroad. There is a Jesus well at the mouth of the River Camel in Cornwall, en route to Glastonbury. At the little village of Priddy, 8 miles to the north of Glastonbury, there is an exceptionally strong legend, linked somehow with the story of a strange energy said to emanate from a cave beneath the church, that Christ was once there as a boy. A commonly used local saying, even today, is, "As sure as our Lord was at Priddy." In Galilee, the tradition that Jesus was a carpenter is accompanied by the story that he visited Britain as a shipwright on a trading vessel from Tyre and was stormbound on the shores of western Britain for an entire winter. So there are encouraging hints of an early link between the Holy Lands and Britain, supported by both historical and archaeological evidence that the Christian religion was practiced in Britain almost immediately after Christ's death. You see, there's a lot of hints at what we're talking about in these stories. So when we look at this history, which is written by the Roman Church, we get these clues that Christianity was already being practiced way before they arrived. The 6th century writer Gildas said that it began in the last year of the reign of Tiberius, which was only 4 years after the crucifixion. A metal drinking vessel of the 1st century AD found at Hadrian's Wall bears an unmistakable early Christian symbol. Glastonbury, under its ancient name Glastonia, is specifically mentioned in religious texts as having had a church before missionaries of the Catholic Church arrived in the 6th century AD. Finally, there is the fact that Joseph himself is a curiously insignificant figure to become the centre of such an important legend, were there not some substance at the back of it. As the writer Geoffrey Ashe has put it, St. Joseph's presence on British soil is too odd under the circumstances to have quite the air of pure invention. Exactly. It's nothing like something that the Roman Catholic Church would invent. Therefore, it probably has some merit. But was Joseph more than a rich merchant who happened to be a Christian? Or, if he was indeed Christ's uncle and made a journey with him during Jesus' youth, did he return after the crucifixion? Did he in fact ever bring the Holy Grail? Here we are on much less firm ground, says this book. The chief cause for uncertainty being that Joseph does not appear in the local saint cults assiduously propagated by the Catholic Church, which actually backs up our version of the story. So by saying that, they're actually reinforcing the fact that because the Roman Church do not push this story, there is probably something in it. The biography of St Dunstan, written about AD 1000, and William of Malmesbury's De Antiquitate, which was AD 1125, both mention the traditions concerning Glastonbury as an early Christian site, but they don't make any mention of Joseph. And they say here that's a striking omission. Well, not really, because if it was as late as 1125, they would be on board with the later version of Christianity. They would be well programmed by the Roman Church. So that again gives some credibility to what we're saying. Significantly, a much later edition of Malmesbury's book, printed after the Arthurian Grail legends had become popular in France, has a reference to Joseph added to the text, making it even more likely, it says here, that Joseph's involvement was a recent invention. Well, not really. All we're talking about here is myth and legend. So in England, it was not until the 15th century that the story of the Grail became embedded in folklore, when Thomas Malory's version of the Arthurian legends was published. He himself worked from French sources, entitling his version of the quest of the Holy Grail as the Tale of the Sangreal, a tale chronicled for one of the truest and one of the holiest, that is, of the world. Then it goes into the Templars, which is not really relevant to what we're talking about. Well, of course, the Grail legends were added to and embellished in the 12th century and became part of the Templar mythology. The poor Knights of Christ were, of course, nothing but, and their early usury and fraction reserve banking is the pillar of today's City of London, of course. A fraud, basically, posing as a noble system. That's all the Knights Templars ever were. They were a very effective and efficient money system within themselves. More legend and made-up stories are in the Red Book of Hergest, including the Mabinogion, of course, the Welsh Mabinogion, which alludes to King Arthur and his court and is full of embellished mysteries and chivalrous stories. So once we get past this 700s to the 1200s, we are really on shaky ground. So we have to go back before that, and we have to think of the Druids and what the Romans took from the Druids, what the Romans did to destroy the reputation of the Druids, how the Romans actually conquered the Druids. And then if we look at the techniques the Romans used, we can see it in their Roman Catholic cult. But none of this helps in getting to the root. In fact, it just takes us away from it, which is the whole point. The Arthur and Holy Grail stories seem to be a big distraction. These are the later stories of the 12th century, of course. However, the link to Glastonbury, now Glastonbury, is important, as Somerset and Glastonbury were the most likely centre of the early Christianity in the British Isles. And of course, we've got the very ancient church in Glastonbury, which was rebuilt. And I've been looking at some of the publicity around it, where they were asking these New Agers and Roman Catholics and Hindus what they thought of this church and how they thought it was represented. And they said, oh, the church was originally round. Well, actually, it was only portrayed as round later, which is another hint at why we need to look at the rewriting of history and get beyond that. The only way to find out anything about this early history is to discount anything written by the church after 600 AD, which is of course very difficult. As we would expect, the official earliest Christian manuscript in Britain is the Lindisfarne Gospels. The Lindisfarne Gospels, of course, taking us back to Lindisfarne. The Lindisfarne Gospels is a manuscript gospel book, probably produced, it says here, around the years 715 to 720, but who knows? Of course, it's in the monastery at Lindisfarne off the coast of Northumberland, which is now in the British Library in London, in case you want to go and try and have a look at it. So if this religion started in the British Isles, it was usurped and imported back through infiltration and a bunch of cover stories. Nothing the Catholic Church says can be used to get back the history. They have covered it up and continue to do so, of course. Britain is the target, so its history will continue to be erased. Ireland, likewise, is also being historically erased. Meanwhile, the Church is one of the main weapons used against the original Christianity. It is a good time to search in the past for clues and answers. Those that have this in mind may hold the key to the whole picture and what is actually being played out. So that is the bigger picture of what we're talking about. If we can get back to these truths, this early form of Christianity, the ancient history of Britain, we are decoding the cover stories which are put in front of us on a daily basis. I hope you found that useful and interesting. It's a good step off point for more research, and for 36 minutes there was quite a lot of information in there. So if you enjoyed that, do stay in touch through the website, and I'll be putting up more shows during the week. That's it from Windows on the World for this episode.